Awesome.
So great morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today. For those, well, everybody's been here before. So again, this is Breakthrough Mastermind Group. The mission for Breakthrough Mastermind Group is really to empower others through the leverage of knowledge to enhance ourselves, both personally and professionally. So again, the premise is built off of the 8 lifestyle categories. And essentially, those are really just to help you create a foundation. If you're ever looking to change who you are, what you are, or where you are in life, it always starts with that foundation and putting in the right pieces. So I am so exuberant about having Amani here with us today. She is in the counseling therapist space. So she literally talks with families all day, every day, helping work through their problems, learning the ins and outs. She is a wealth of knowledge. Her and I have had the privilege of working together on a couple projects, which has been phenomenal. I know she's going to bring the heat today. So again, guys, the way that this works is that we will quite simply allow her to speak. And Amani, really, you have the floor. So as long as you want, just run with it. And then as soon as she concludes, what we will do is we will open it up for Q&A. So again, please jot any questions down that you may have. And at this point, Amani, I'm going to give you the floor.
Awesome. Awesome. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this mastermind group. I've been so looking forward to just being able to share like some things that I've found, things that I've been doing just in my own research and in my own study and being in the field. And a lot of the things that I do see impact our relationships for the most part. So I am a firm believer that like everything that we do is based off of the premises of relationships, your family relationship, your work relationship, friend relationship. That's kind of like where everything derives from. And there's often times that we have like so many obstacles and struggles that we run into when it comes to relationships, which really means just how we relate to others. So I am a marriage and family therapist. I'm located in Long Island, New York. I am working for Gotham MFT under the supervision of Andy Lynn Cornfield. I specialize in working not only with individuals, but couples and families as well, like Keegan said earlier. So today I wanted to talk to you all about the impact of our primary relationships. Now, when I say primary relationships, I'm going back to like your first recollection of what it meant for you to relate and connect with others. So your primary relationship would start with your parent or guardian. Your relationship with your parents oftentimes impacts the way you show up in relationships. Now, over the course of my studies, I found that there are plenty of exceptions to this rule that's kind of thrown out there. It's definitely not a science. Our relationships are not destined to look exactly like our parents. People can change their approach and how they show up in relationships every day. However, I also can't deny the basic premise that our parents do play a pivotal role in shaping our adult relationships. I'm convinced the bigger influence on our adult relationships is not necessarily what we saw from our parents, but what we experienced in our relationships with interacting with our parents. So for example, I kind of want you to think about a couple of these questions as we go through some of the things that I share with you. How did your parents respond to your emotions? Did they make you feel safe? How did they communicate with you? How was conflict dealt with in your family? Were your parents emotionally predictable or emotionally unpredictable? Did they validate your concerns, your wants, or your needs? Exploring questions like these can really get you to the why behind the unique struggles or hangups you experience in your adult relationships, particularly in your romantic relationships. So I want to share with you guys kind of just like 5 ways that our parents do impact the way that we relate to others. This is going to kind of tie in specifically towards romance, but you can also apply this to, like I said before, work relationships, family relationships, and even friendships in your life. So the first point I want to make is that your relationship with your parents teach you how to show affection. The relationship with your parents during the early years in your life set the tone for how we see, give, and receive love. It gives us a template of what we want and what we look for in our relationships. So your parents are pretty much everything as a child. When you are a child, you haven't gone through too many life experiences or developed a strong sense of critical thinking skills to make decisions for yourself. So as children, we tend to just accept the way things are, thinking it's right, even if it's not beneficial for us. So for example, if your parents were not very affectionate and hardly ever hugged or kissed you, you may have an aversion to affection as an adult. Research proves that children will model and emulate the ways their parents show love to one another. It also impacts the way the child is able to express love as well. Another example are the ways in which anger and conflict were managed in your family. This impacts how we communicate with adult romantic partners. Whether or not a person tends to express their emotions more openly or tends to move towards passive aggression, which I'm also guilty of myself, frequently parallels how their parents communicated with each other and with the child. So the second point I would like to make is that your relationship with your parents kind of becomes that voice that's in your head. So their voice becomes like your inner voice. Think about where your parents' patterns of communication, thoughts, and feelings like originated. It could have been from their grandparents and their mom and dad and their great grandparents. So these patterns of communication influence the way that you think, the way that you feel, and it all originates from the origin of your family. So reflect on your childhood and try to remember the patterns you had in interacting with your parents. When you think about your thoughts in terms of, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. If you do this, then you're a good person. If you don't do this, then you're a bad person. Whose voice is that? Is it your adult voice of what you think and believe? Or does it come from somewhere or someone else? If your parents are still living, notice how you interact with your parents now, and then see how those patterns may be playing out in your romantic relationships or your friendships. The third point I wanted to make is the relationship with your parents influences the way that we attach ourselves to others. How do you show up in relationships? Have you ever been told that you come off needy or clingy? Or maybe you've been told that you're too emotionally distant or dismissive. If our parents showed love, responded to our needs, and validated our feelings, we are more likely to develop a secure attachment style. As adults, we will seek out relationships that reflect our esteem and will naturally gravitate and commit to relationships that are fulfilling. On the flip side, if we had an insecure attachment developed with our parents, we may have a very fragmented sense of self. This may lead to low self-esteem, anxiety in relationships, doubt that we can trust others, and sometimes subconsciously seek out relationships that mimic the same dynamic. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. Our nervous system associates familiar with safety. Another point I wanted to make is that the relationship with your parents also influences the way that you communicate. As children, we don't know the difference between effective and ineffective communication. The only type of communication we know is the communication we experience at home. And even as we grow older and can easily identify different communication styles, changing the communication patterns we developed as children is no easy task. Sometimes we communicate with our parents in much the same way our parents communicated with us. Odds are that if your parents communicated with you in a clear and direct way, you communicate in much the same way with romantic partners. Other times, however, we develop defenses to our parents' ways of communicating that follow us into our adult relationships. When a partner expresses sadness or other difficult emotions, for example, we may disengage or conceal our emotions in much the same way we learned to do as children. The last point I wanted to make is it influences your ability to set and maintain boundaries in your life. So I got a chance to kind of like review over the last mastermind class that was done. I forgot the lady's name, but she did such a phenomenal job really covering how to set boundaries in your life. So I wanted to also add this in regards to the way that you set and maintain boundaries also come from the way that you were able to relate to your parents. So there's a lot of talk these days about setting healthy boundaries, what it is, what it isn't, how you should do it, and rightfully so. Many of us never learn how to set boundaries while growing up. And worse yet, when our boundaries are crossed or ignored by our caregivers or other adults, we can easily grow to believe we don't have a right to set limits in our relationships, continuously denying ourselves of our needs. Of course, there are different types of boundaries. Some relate to physical space, some have to do with privacy, some involve behaviors and actions, and still others have to do with physical touch. When your parents respect your personal space and take the time to inquire about your personal preferences, boundary setting becomes a whole lot easier in your adult relationships. On the other hand, if your parents made a habit of snooping around your room, reading your diary, reading personal notes or text messages, invading your privacy, simply not respecting your wishes around touch and other preferences, setting boundaries with partners is likely to be an area of struggle for you. So, how do we deal with all of this? So, these are kind of just the 5 main ways that they show up in relationships, but how do we deal with it? So, the question of whether we can truly escape the shadow of our parents' relationship and how they have shaped or influenced our personalities can be pretty complicated or complex. The first step is self-awareness. And I'm pretty sure you guys have probably heard this from Keegan, a whole bunch of other maybe therapists or counselors, that this is really the first step when it comes to pretty much anything. Self-awareness. Learning to be aware of all of the many ways your parents and your family have shaped who you are. Learning to accept that in some ways, our upbringing is always going to have some degree of influence on us. Even if that influence isn't helpful, we will still be influenced by it. Being willing to try to correct or compensate for this influence when you feel like it's stopping you from living your life properly is the process of being self-aware. Now, the process of exploring this and finding a way of being that works often happens over the course of time. It's not something that happens overnight. And sometimes it may require the help of a professional along the way. Counselors are trained to help people explore their feelings, identify their triggers, identify their patterns, and find the root of where those feelings are coming from. By talking to a counselor or life coach over a period of weeks, months, or years, many people begin to recognize the source of certain behaviors and begin to think about whether these behaviors need modifying. Another way to deal with this is by journaling, painting, or drawing. I'm going to go with the journaling route because that's usually what I tell my clients to do. Journaling allows you to organize your thoughts in a way that gives you a very clear view of what you're feeling. If you happen to be someone who is a overthinker or someone who always tends to have their mind racing, when you're able to organize your thoughts, it takes everything that's kind of happening up here and it puts it down on paper so it's more clear for you to see what's actually happening in terms of the flow of your emotions. So you can find numerous journal prompts on Google about inner child healing and reparenting. And reparenting is simply going in and being that parent that you wanted your parent to be, but you more so doing it for yourself, giving yourself that love and affection, teaching yourself how to communicate. Lastly, the fact that our parents affect our relationships is not in of itself a bad thing. In fact, when you grow up in a loving family with emotionally mature parents, you can expect to enjoy deep, satisfying connections in your intimate relationships. And when issues do arise, you'll likely be well equipped to deal with them in healthy, effective ways. Just because your relationship with one or both of your parents was less than optimal doesn't mean you're destined for unfulfilling romantic relationships or friendships. It simply means it may take some work on your part, or even together with your partner and your family, if they are willing, to build the relationship you desire the most.
Wow,
And that
Amani.
is it.
Definitely did not disappoint. I took so many notes. I loved all that information and the perspectives that you brought. I know that a lot of questions came up in my mind with the information that you shared, but first I would like to open it to the group and see if anybody has any questions for Amani. Well, I'm gonna dive in because one of the big ones is really critical. I mean, I want to first share a story. I think that what Amani was touching on, and one of the things that I would love to explore your thoughts on, Amani, are quite simply rewiring our programs, right? So, I think about, you said that
Yeah.
there could be good and bad, right? Which is very, very, very true. I think of a pain inflicted
Hmm.
story, and I was a child and I walked into this Walmart with my mom. There's just the two of us. I was about 5 years old, and I saw this little tiger figurine that was on the shelf, and I just grabbed it and I put it into my pocket. And then, we left the store and we went home, and I was emptying my pockets, and my mom saw this little tiger figurine. So we had a family friend that was a police officer, and she invited the cop to come over, and essentially he cuffed me. I was a 5-year-old. He literally put me in cuffs, put me in the back of the cop car, and kind of drove me around. And he was really mean. But he kept asking me things like, is this really where you want your life to go? Do you really want to end up in jail for stealing? So at that point in time, there was a major affliction of pain in that situation. Now, I'm grateful for that experience because now I affiliated pain with stealing. So I bring all that back to the rewiring component, because that is a program that my mom gave to me that I'm grateful for. But there are also situations where our parents, they don't give us the right programming. So I say all that because, Amani, I'm really curious to hear, what are some of the ways that you would recommend for people as adults to rewire some of that programming that maybe isn't so healthy or good for us?
Yeah. So I actually have a similar story to yours with the whole stealing thing. And it was actually the exact same age too. I was 5 when I did something very
Funny.
similar. So I was like, I feel so seen. I was like, I feel so seen right now. But in terms of kind of just like going in and rewiring some of that program, when you think of some of like the pain points in your childhood, like think about things that still till this day like irritate you, whether it's in other people or like within yourself, the way that you communicate and respond. Think about that. That's your wound. That's what needs to kind of be dealt with for the most part. So in terms of doing that, if your parents really weren't able to communicate with you in an effective way, you might need to go in and kind of rewire some of the ways that you communicate in your life, and just take a hard, like honest look at the way that you show up in relationships in terms of communicating what it is that you want, what it is that you need, what it is that you don't like. Because I know for myself, growing up in an environment that when you did something wrong, you kind of got yelled at, or you were in a situation where you were stealing, and rather than, really having a sit down talk and saying like, I know that this was a mistake and we all make mistakes, but like, this is something that's just not acceptable to our society and you shouldn't be doing it. We immediately kind of go into like scolding and scorning, kind of doing that tough love. And a lot of the times it's like, tough love can work for some people, but then for some other people, it's not really a good tactic, because all it shows is that mistakes are bad and you shouldn't make mistakes. And if you do make mistakes, then you're a bad person. And if you're a bad person, then you belong in jail. And so it's just like, with that way of thinking, it's like, what are we really doing to kind of get to the root of what it really is? Like, in your situation, you were 5 years old. In my situation, you were 5 years old. And for you in particular, that technique worked. But for some other people, that could have been a very traumatizing situation to, I don't know if you were handcuffed or anything, but to even go through that experience of having to be in the back of a police car and not really know if you're going to see your parents or your friends again, that can be a traumatic experience for some people. So I think it's really going in and really just identifying what is the actual wound that's showing up for you in a lot of your relationships. And I tell my clients all the time, the thing that irritates you the most is the wound. Like, find what it is, like get to the cracks and crevice of it to figure out like, what is it about the way that this person talks to me, or the way that I speak to them, or what it is that they're doing that like really, really, really irritates me. And oftentimes you'll find that it stems from something that happened in your childhood. And the way that your mind and body perceived it now has been the way that you've kind of just been using that as a template to go on in your life and in your relationships.
Thank you so much for those points, Amani. I think the big thing that really stood out to me is you got to face the fear, or as you worded it, the wound, right? And I think that may be a little bit more appropriate when we're talking about family and emotions and things of that nature. But that reminds me of a story. So there was this guy that I met in Baltimore years ago, and we were just having a conversation. This guy told me that there were two routes that he could travel. Has anybody ever seen Step Brothers, the movie? You know that scene where I think it's Dale and Brennan where they're like, we can go the short way or we can go the long way. It's 45 minutes. And he's like, but Brennan, that's 45 minutes. Why would we go that way? He's like, man, because there are these kids, I want to avoid the kids. And then they end up going the short way and a bunch of these little kids beat them up. So I think about that with this Baltimore story. There's this guy that I knew, and he had a similar path. He had two pathways that he could take, and one was the short way and one was the long way. And he told me that the reason he didn't like the short route was because there was this dog, and he had this fear his entire life because he had a bad experience as a child with a dog. So he always would go the long route home. And finally, one day, he decided that today is the day I'm going to face this fear, or as Amani put it, I'm going to face this wound. And essentially, he started down this short path. And just like every other time, this dog started following him. And it was chasing him for a while. And finally, he just stopped and he was like, what am I doing? Today's my day. And he grabbed a loose brick and he turned around to face the dog and realized that the dog didn't even have teeth. So this whole time, he was afraid of this dog that really couldn't inflict pain on him. So I share that story because I think Amani said it beautifully. It's that, we all have these wounds and we really have to just face them. But oftentimes the fear that we have in our heads around this wound or around this pain are just self-inflicted, and they're not even real pains. We don't have the fear of walking outside, and seeing a saber-toothed tiger or having a boulder fall on our heads. Like, those aren't common things anymore. Those are real fears, but we don't really face those anymore. So I think that's a beautiful point, is to, really face those wounds and then be able to rewire it from there. So thank you for that. Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts or points that they would like to address? Ashley?
Yeah, 1 second. No, baby, I'm not done yet. Okay. What Imani said about like what bothers you is like the wound basically. And I totally can relate to that. Just kind of like knowing your triggers, and especially, I have two young children, they're 3.5 and 1. And like crying is like, that's a trigger for me. Like tantrums, like crying, like it's a trigger for me. And I can often be quick to be like, stop crying. Like, that's enough. There's nothing to cry about. But I have learned a lot. And I have learned that letting them cry and doing something for myself, it kind of makes the situation better. And I definitely think that that's because, like, being raised, it was like, if you're going to cry, you're going to go to your room. And like, there's nothing to cry about, basically. Don't be upset about anything. That carried on like into my adulthood and like intimate relationships as well. And so like, I can see where that could carry on in my parenting style, but I don't have to let it. And that's like the biggest thing, is like, you have the power to change that. And then in that, like, repairing for myself, like knowing it's okay for myself to be upset, no matter what anybody else says, like, it's not about anyone else, it's about me, processing and repairing. And so that was like something that I could kind of get out of this. And then also like communication. I think like growing up there, like, wasn't too much like going in with like the emotions thing. Like, there wasn't like a lot of emotional processing. I think that's probably a common denominator with like a lot of my generation, but I try to go above and beyond with my children, even though they are so young, to kind of coach them through and try to figure it out. And A lot of times my 3-year-old, he doesn't want to talk about it. And I'm like, all right, that's fine. We don't have to talk about it right now. If you want to talk about it, I'm here when you're ready. And that seems to be like, he does end up wanting to talk about it when it's his time, and so, yeah, that's kind of what I've got.
That's so awesome, Ashley. And I think just even the points that you touched on is pretty much like the outcome of like all of these things that we were talking about. I was watching a video a few months ago and I forgot the lady's name, but she was saying that the way that you communicate with your children really impacts the way that they're able to communicate their thoughts, their feelings with others in like their own relationships in their lives. So she was saying as a parent, if you see that your child is angry, you can say things like, I can see that you're angry, and kind of just sit with them through that anger, like through the processing of those emotions, versus you shouldn't be mad. Why are you angry right now? I should be the one that's mad. So now you're telling that child that they can't have a sense of self. Like what they're feeling, they shouldn't be feeling. What they're doing, they shouldn't be doing. So now it's like you go into all of these other relationships in your life, your friendships, your teen relationships, your adult relationships. And it's like, I don't know how I should feel. I don't know how I should think. I don't know if this is a good or bad feeling. I don't know what to attach this emotion to. And then we find ourselves in a lot of codependent relationships. It's another conversation for a different day. But the way that we respond to our children really is imperative to help them to understand how to process their emotions and understand it. And actually, I love the fact that you touched on your own childhood, because a lot of the times, the way that our parents were able to respond to us, we end up responding the same way to other people and to our children. So when you look at maybe your dynamic with your parents, I don't know if this was exactly the dynamic, but if emotions were just not tolerated in the house, they were literally intolerable and your parents didn't really know what to do with your emotions, it's like you learn the same thing. I have these emotions, I don't know what to do with them. And it irritates me when someone's actually expressing sadness or anger. So I love the way that you kind of beautifully put it, but all those things are really a major factor. And I just love what it is that you're doing with your children now and actively taking the steps to do something different. So I know that probably comes with a whole bunch of maybe different views from your own original family and your friends even maybe so, but it's wonderful that you're taking a different approach because you can see how that dynamic, maybe did help you in some ways, but also it could have possibly hindered you in some ways as well.
Yeah, those are
Thank
great
you.
points.
And then like you said, I was just going to say, I do have boys. And so I think it's so much more important too, knowing that someday, they're going to have relationships and they need to know how to be there for their partners. They need to know how they should respond, and I just think that's really, I don't know. I see that already in how young my 3-year-old is. Cole, please stop. Let me stop. And I don't know, I just think it's really cool. I had the thought the other day, I was like, he's gonna be the best little boyfriend ever to someone, because it's some of the way he treats me, so it's really cool to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you both for sharing that. It reminds me of another story. So when I first got into the insurance financial advising space years ago, there was an individual, Simon, and I'm not going to tell you his last name for proprietary reasons, but this guy, Simon, was, he grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and he grew up with just his mom. His dad wasn't in the picture, and his mom was such a hard worker. She worked 3 jobs, was always working to the point where he never really got to see her. And I think that he inherited a lot of those qualities and traits as well. But I'll never forget this one story that he shared with us. And, just to create the context of the situation, this guy is, probably about 240, all muscle. He's got tribal tats. His entire back is tatted. This guy he's not the first person you'd probably want to fight if you saw him in the street, is what I'm getting at. And he started training MMA professionally because he's a very, very wealthy. He's made probably close to $1 billion throughout his career. So I'll never forget, this big, tough guy, super wealthy, comes in and he starts this speech one day and he goes, you know what, guys, I cry. And everybody in the back is kind of like laughing. They're like, what is this guy talking about? And he's like, look, you know, one of the emotional intelligence things that I learned throughout life is that people often, especially for guys, they try to avoid that emotional response. He said, but the reality is if you go through pain or trouble or anything, face it, right? Let that emotion out. And if you have to cry it out, cry it out. But do it for 2 or 3 or 5 minutes and learn from it and move on. Don't let that hold you back or keep you prisoner in that situation. So I wanted to share that because I thought it was relevant to basically what Ashley and Amani had just shared. But you know, Marlene, I would love to hear your viewpoint because I know that, thank you for joining us. I know you had some troubles with the internet right now, but you have a situation that's very unique, right? And you're in this particular situation with family that's very much a part of your decision making right now. And you don't necessarily have to get into any of that stuff if you don't want to. But I think a lot of the points that Amani really touched on at the introductory was about how much our responses are shaped by our parental units. So Marlene, I would just love to hear any thoughts or comments or questions that you have on the topic.
Well, my parents will be married 63 years on the 23rd of this month. And they're very close. Growing up, every decision they made was a joint decision. They were very unified on how they disciplined us, how they raised us, etc. But my parents were also very reactionary. And I have realized that I was very reactionary for many, many years and didn't understand it. I didn't get it. I didn't see it. And it's interesting because when you start becoming aware of who you are, how you are, and when you start really looking at yourself, I've correlated it always in my mind with, there's a verse in the Bible that speaks about how we can look in the mirror and then as soon as we turn away, we forget what we look like, we forget. So this has been a process for me of training, literally. You talk about rewiring and retraining on not being so reactionary. And I have found that I stop and I look and I think, and I try to get all of the picture and the puzzle pieces because I don't want to go off half-cocked because I've done that before. One of my biggest detriments from when I was young was that I was going to be a hard-headed tucker like my dad, just hard-headed, and honey, I have been. And it has put me on some paths, but here's the flip side of that. I walked the roads that I walked, but all of us in that, there became a sense of, I started becoming prideful about the fact that doesn't matter, you know, I'm going to do it Marlene's way, and by golly, I'm doing it. And so there's other things that come in with that reactionary part of yourself that can be negative and detrimental if you don't really look at it. So I try to be much more observant. I try not to jump to conclusions. And here's the other thing about reactionary responses. And I'm not just talking about my parents, I'm talking about friends and family in general. So many times, the reactionary aftermath was not based on all the information needed. So here you've spent all this time and energy and emotion. You've gotten yourself all worked up, and folks, so many times you've just wasted time. And like that country song, this wasted time is killing me. Well, it does. So the rewiring, definitely, and it is a diligent process.
Absolutely. Thank you so, so much for sharing that, Marlene. I think, you know, just kind of like hearing you talk about like your own experiences with that, I can tell that you've done a lot of inner work in terms of just like figuring out like what's going on here for me, why is it showing up in this way, and being able to kind of like look at your parents from a standpoint of like they're human as well, and they learned these behaviors from their parents, and their parents learned it from their parents. So it doesn't necessarily make them bad people, but that's the way that they respond to emotions. And in terms of like what you're talking about and having like more of a reaction-based response, more of an impulsive response, now what it seems like you're working on is more of like responding rather than reacting.
Yes.
Because a lot of the times our reactions will get us in a lot of trouble, because it's really just the emotions that are stirring up in us, and we either get defensive and we're trying to like create this force field of like protecting ourselves, but then we're pushing away everybody else, rather than being more thoughtful in our responses and saying like, okay, let me maybe consider this factor. Maybe this could possibly be a perspective that I haven't thought about. But because you kind of like watched your parents do that, that was like the original template in terms of what you should do. It's like you didn't know any other resource or any other like lane to take, because they kind of teach you how to like navigate the world. So I'm so glad that you learned for yourself that there are other ways to be able to respond to others. And, you know, being able to take that hard look in the mirror is not something that's easy. It's it feels very intolerable for people. I'm even, you know, as a therapist myself, they always say like a therapist should have their own therapist. And I have my own therapist. And when I talk to her sometimes, like she'll point that mirror up and I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, okay, maybe you're right there. And it's that hard look, but you know, it also takes that courage and that bravery to be able to say like, okay, this is who I am. And this doesn't define who I'm destined to be. Like, this is just where I'm at right now. And I'm figuring out the steps that I'm taking to get to a place that I would much rather be. So you worded it like so beautifully. And I'm so glad that like your own individual experiences have literally led you up to this point right now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah, of course, of course.
And one thing I can tell you is Marlene does put in the work. She does a lot of that introspection work, which it shows. I created a graph a couple, I don't know, years ago, and I think it's relevant to what was just shared, but you were talking about the reactionary side, Marlene, and I think I've shared this with you, but it's very simple. It's basically broken into 4 quadrants. So you have, you know, a square, 4 squares inside of that big square. And basically it's when your emotion is really high, your logic response is really low. And the alternative is true. When your logic is really high, usually your emotional response is really low. So I'll do my best to get that together and share it with you guys, because for me at least, and this may not be the case for you, which is fine, but for me, it's really easy to have that visual and just think about that every time. It's like, okay, cool. Am I reacting with a high emotion and low logic, or is the alternative the case? So I'll get that out to you guys. But another big thing that stood out was the forgiveness, right? And Amani harped on this a little bit about how, look, oftentimes our parents are reacting because of their parents, and this is what they learned. So you really have 2 choices. You can either hold it against them and be upset and mad and, you know, vengeful, or you can forgive them and understand it for what it's worth. You know, I think back to my own example about my stepfather, who was extremely abusive. And I had a choice at one point in my life, and I could have said, okay, look, I am either choosing to hold this against him and hate him and be vengeful, But then I would hold all this hate in my own heart. But the alternative is the route that, and it took me a while to learn this, but I had to be forgiving. And I actually wrote him a note 3 different times, long notes with my thoughts and emotions and feelings. And I basically forgave him. And he never responded, which I didn't think he would, but I let that hate out of my heart. And that's the most important part, is how long are you going to let something that somebody else did, whether it's your parents or other relationships, hold you down? You know, the reality is, if you hold on to that hate, the only person it affects is you. So you really have to, and it takes a lot of introspection, like Marlene and Imani just talked about, but you really have to analyze this from yourself. And sometimes that can be really difficult. You guys used the great example of holding that mirror. Well, sometimes it's really hard to hold that mirror in front of you and see the truths and face them. So beautiful points. Matt, I'd love to hear from you. I know that your dynamics are very interesting, and I'll leave it at that, whatever you'd like to share, but I'd love to hear your thoughts or feedback or comments on this topic.
Yeah, well, all I gotta say is, I gave Dr. Phil a permanent hard-on for a whole season just to be able to deal with all the things that have gone on in my life. So I see 2 therapists, one regularly and one for EMDR, because I grew up in a family of narcissists. And when you're the only empathic person, you really are like Paramore, you're the only exception. So ultimately, it's been difficult for me to have relationships, in general, because I never had the unconditional love from my parents. I never had that validation. I was always looking for it. And, it was like, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's like, I can't find it. I don't know where the hell it is. So ultimately, that has affected me in my entire life. And it's been, in that respect, emotionally lonely for a long time. And so, and unfortunately, society tends to look down on men that express themselves as weak or beta or simps, or, just get over it. So unfortunately, society doesn't assist men, in that respect. So that's why I'm not always, keen to offer it, because the stigmatism is there, where men are supposed to be tough and the supporters, and just get through it, your man, get over it. That's bullshit. It's more than just that. And so ultimately, a lot of times I find that people, especially women, only want to deal with me when I'm the winner at the finish line. They don't want to help me build the castle. They expect the castle to already be there. So it's like, why bother? I mean, so if I want pain and misery, I'll just go over to my parents. So ultimately, that's been tough. I have to rewire my whole way of being because of my parents and what wasn't there. So I've learned that people could be there for you financially, but not emotionally and mentally, And so ultimately, when it came to my parents, because all 3 are narcissists, my brother's a narcissist, my sister's a narcissist, and then I'm the empath. So talk about not fitting in. So ultimately, that's where it's been a tough, road for me, not because I want to find a narcissist, but because they tend to gravitate toward me. And it isn't a familiarity, so I don't realize until it's too late. So now I have a plethora of warning signs where I know somebody's being narcissistic. And so when the red flag goes off, I stay the hell away. And so ultimately, I'd rather fly solo than be with people that make me feel solo, and not Han either.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing. I think with like pretty much everything that you said, you really like hit the nail like right on the head. We're not conditioned in society a lot of times to like express emotion, especially for men. Express emotion, kind of just tough it out, get over it. And that's society within itself has literally gaslighted us. And what gaslighting is pretty like telling us that our reality isn't our reality, basically telling us that the sky isn't blue. What you're seeing is not what it is that's actually happening. So if you've grown up around a lot of narcissists or people that gaslight you, people that are emotionally unavailable, and you happen to be the person that is emotionally available and empathic, you know, it really does take a toll on your esteem.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And that's why I have so many issues. And so ultimately, you know, like my first therapist, he says, well, Matt, you got to have compassion for yourself. And you have to be the parent to yourself that my parents never were to me. And so it's sometimes, you know, hard to get self-love besides a tissue box. So ultimately, you know, having that ability to have that, you know, that reflection is fine. So at this point, you know, I'd rather sit there and, you know, be myself, find out if you really can handle me or not. And then if you can't, I'd rather just have a frozen moment and just let it go. It isn't worth it to me. So whether it's personal or professional, you know, really one thing I've worked on, especially this year, is my self-worth and my self-esteem and my self-value. So I've learned to, you know, engage in the one strike and you're out rule, which has been very, especially with women, which has been very, you know, cathartic, especially the past month. And, you know, like Natasha Bedingfield with me, the rest is still unwritten.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, you know, reparenting, I feel like that technique is like really, really helpful, because inevitably you really are coming up with a new way in terms of just being able to not only relate to others, but then also find ways that you relate to yourself. But a lot of the times that I find what's really hard with reparenting is like, we still kind of want to go back to like that original template of whatever it looked like. Because if we kind of just like press the delete button on what our parents did, you're kind of sitting there and you're like, okay, well, now what do I do? Like, how do I communicate? How do I love myself? How do I show myself this esteem that I was never given? So it's really about going in and kind of like setting what works for you. And the rule that you were talking about in terms of dating and like giving people chances, that can be really hard if you've been surrounded by a lot of people that kind of just completely disregarded you. So kind of like I said before, your mind and your body and like your nervous system, all three of those things, like they work together. So it's like it creates this force field around you of like, we want you to feel safe, we want you to feel comfortable, we don't want you to be hurt. And everything that you think, you do, you feel, the way that you respond is in like a mere reflection of that, trying to protect yourself. So like I said before, it doesn't make you a bad person, but like we're all human. And before we had things like phones and houses and jobs and all this stuff, we were really kind of just going off of just survival. So our body is kind of like wired and our mind is wired to do whatever is going to keep us alive. And if keeping us alive means pushing people away, or if keeping us alive comes with these coping mechanisms that feel good, but in turn they could be unhealthy, that's kind of what the mind and body wants to do. And that's going a little bit more into kind of like, I study a lot on like the subconscious mind, the ego, the id, the super ego, because it has a lot to do with like the way that you relate to yourself and relate to others. But that's a different conversation for a different day. But it's just good to know that the way that you have been responding is all really an act of you just trying to protect yourself. And sometimes
keep in mind that humans were not meant to do what we're doing today.
Exactly. Right.
We're originally hunters and gatherers, and the reason why people socialize, and that's why either we feel socially inept or empty or what have you, is because by biology over thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years, unless you were with the group, you didn't physically survive. So those instincts have been instilled in us, but ultimately, if all I'm worth, especially when it comes to women, is just what you can get out of me, and then you discard me like a condom or tampon, all I am is a dollar sign to you, or, why would I want anything to do with you? So I really don't know if I'll ever have a relationship with a girl, except for like the family dog, ever in my life. And so ultimately I've given up, probably permanently, and I just can't deal with it. Bitches be tripping and nobody helps them up. So ultimately, I can't mentally handle it anymore. I'm burnt out. So, I'd rather just sleep with my stuffed animals than to deal with the aggravation.
So a lot of emotion in there. I want to share one last thing and then we're going to have to close out. But, one of the things, Matt, that comes to mind is people pleasing. And I'm not saying that that's your particular scenario, but oftentimes when we're surrounded by narcissists, we get into these grooves and habits of becoming a people pleaser. And that's male or female, it doesn't matter. So one of the things that I've learned through that process is that there's an element of assertiveness that needs to be taken place. And oftentimes, male or female, again, may think that that may come across as crude or non-emotional or whatever words. There are other words that may not be the most appropriate. But the point is that if you are in that situation where you've been surrounded by narcissists and people are always, above you and they think they're better than you and they're going to push you into the ground to get whatever they want, then you become that people pleaser and your image of yourself changes. So I would just challenge you to really analyze your own image of yourself. And Amani touched on this at the very beginning, but that level of attachment, there's an interesting thing about attachment that we all need to explore, because again, if the programming and wiring that we have is from our parents, is there a level of attachment that you have with the outcome that they had? And again, that's a whole nother broad topic: attachment, people pleasing, all of those things. But guys, we do have to close out. I just want to say thank you so much for your time today. This was remarkable. I loved hearing from everybody, Amani, Ashley, Marlene, Matt, you guys had some phenomenal points. And that's the whole purpose of this group, is to bring these different perspectives and then have an open forum and see what other people's experiences are towards that, or whatever they can help with or share. So does anybody have any last minute questions, comments, or concerns within the last minute before we hop off? Great. Okay, guys. Well, again, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I hope that you learned something today. Amani, we greatly appreciate your presence here today. You gave some phenomenal information. I know I'm going to come back and watch this video again. I will share it with everybody as well. If you guys need anything at all, just reach out, and I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. You guys have a wonderful day, okay?
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye.
Thank you.